Most of us know about the legend of Santa Claus. We know about the reindeer, the elves, the chimney, but a lot of us, including me and maybe including you, don't know where Santa Claus actually comes from. Recently, I watched a movie called Klaus. It's a retelling of the origins of Santa Claus, and it's pretty original too. And it sparked my interest in actually learning where the idea of Santa Claus first came from. Most will tell you that he's just St. Nicholas, or St. Nick for short, but there's a lot more to it than that. And you probably didn't know much of what I'm going to tell you, and to be honest, before I did my own research for this video, I didn't either. So who is he? Why is he breaking into our homes? Why does no one ever catch him? How does he know what everyone wants for Christmas? Are the elves his slaves? These are all questions that will not be answered in this video. But the question that will be answered is, where does Santa Claus come from? To start, we have to go all the way back to March 15th, 270. This is the birth date of St. Nicholas of Myra, the same St. Nick with which Santa Claus shares a name. Now, not a lot is known about St. Nicholas, as the earliest account of his life and his achievements wasn't written until centuries after he died, so there is some speculation about his actual existence, but there is evidence that shows that he was real and that he was an actual saint. For example, his name was on a list of attendees of a council that was held in 325, and within 200 years of his death, the St. Nicholas Church was built in Myra, where his remains were supposedly kept until 1087, when Bari merchants stole his skeleton and enshrined it at the Basilica di San Nicola. Anyways, St. Nicholas was a real person and he was a saint. But how do we go from some random saint in the 4th century to Santa Claus in the modern day? Well, first, we have to look at what St. Nicholas actually did when he was alive. The most famous story of St. Nicholas comes from a father in a sticky situation. This father had been wealthy but had lost his fortune due to quote-unquote the plotting and envy of Satan, which is a bit ambiguous, but regardless, he was now poor and could not pay the dowry for any of his 3 daughters, which means that they could not marry and would probably be forced into prostitution. So St. Nicholas, being the apparently generous person that he was, secretly tossed a bag of gold coins to cover the dowry for the first daughter. Then later on, he did this a second time for the second daughter. And eventually he also paid the dowry of the 3rd daughter as well. But if he did this in secret, how did anyone ever know? Well, it turns out that after his second daughter's dowry had been paid, the father stayed awake to catch the payment for his 3rd daughter. And lo and behold, he had caught St. Nicholas red-handed. And even though St. Nicholas ordered the father to tell no one about this, the story is still being told, and it's unclear who the source of this story is. But regardless, this story of St. Nicholas's gift-giving is the foundation for Santa Claus. But the foundation is not enough. There's a lot more to Santa Claus than just St. Nick. This brings us to Sinterklaas. Sinterklaas is the Dutch translation of St. Nicholas, and he's also the primary focal point and figure of the Feast of Sinterklaas, which is celebrated on the 5th and 6th of December. The feast is celebrated with gift-giving on St. Nicholas Eve on the 5th of December, and in some places on the morning of December 6th, which is St. Nicholas Day. Now, if you look closely and you sound out Sinterklaas, this sounds very, very similar to Santa Claus. And over several hundred years, when St. Nicholas became Sinterklaas, it was retranslated back into English as Santa Claus. We'll talk more about this later on. So now, let's talk about Sinterklaas, but in America. In 1770s New York, a newspaper talks about a feast day for Santa Claus. And apparently, it was celebrated by Dutch descendants because New York City used to be the Dutch colonial town of New Amsterdam. Then, in 1809, a man named Washington Irving sparks the revival of St. Nicholas and Dutch folklore in New York with stories of Dutch legends in his A History of New York. Then, 1 year later in 1810, a man named John Pinter published a pamphlet with an old Dutch Sinterklaas poem alongside the English translation. But on the Dutch side, St. Nicholas is called Santa Claus. 2 years after that, Irving revises his A History of New York to include a dream sequence where St. Nicholas flies over treetops in a flying wagon. It's also important to note that during the Reformation of the 16th and 17th century in Europe, Santa Claus was replaced by Christkindl as the traditional gift giver across many parts of Europe, and the date of gift giving was actually changed to Christmas Eve. And just like with St. Nicholas becoming Santa Claus and then Santa Claus, Christ Child became Christkindl, and this became Kris Kringle, which will pop up later on too. Now briefly, I will talk about Father Christmas. This is the Christmas gift giver that was based in England for quite some time. While most of Santa's attributes do come from Dutch origins and Father Christmas is separate, these two pretty much became one and the same in the 1850s. This is because Santa Claus became popular in America in the 50s, and after it became popular there, it became popular in England too. And so now these two pretty much share the same traits, the same characteristics, and they're pretty much the same person. But before the 1850s, we gotta go back to 1821, and we're still gonna be in New York. And that's because this was the year that an anonymous poem with illustrations was published, called Old Santa Claus with Much Delight. This poem has the first mention of a sleigh being pulled by a reindeer. It's the first mention of Santa arriving on Christmas Eve, and it's also the earliest published depictions of Santa Claus. This is the entire poem. Old Santa Claus with much delight, his reindeer drives this frosty night o'er chimney tops and tracks of snow to bring his yearly gifts to you. The steady friend of virtuous youth, the friend of duty and of truth, each Christmas Eve he joys to come, where peace and love have made their home. Through many houses he has been, and various beds and stockings seen, some white as snow and neatly mended, others that seemed for pigs intended. To some I gave a pretty doll, to some a peg top or a ball, no crackers, cannons, squibs, or rockets, to blow their eyes up or their pockets. Wherever I found good girls or boys that hated quarrels, strife, and noise, I left an apple or a tart, or a wooden gun or painted cart. No drums to stun their mother's ear, nor swords to make their sisters fear, but pretty books to store their mind with knowledge of each various kind. But where I found the children naughty, in manners crude and temper haughty, thankless to parents, liars, swears, boxers or cheats or base tale bearers, I left a long black birchen rod, such as the dread command of God directs a parent's hand to use when virtue's path his sons refuse. So here we also get that nice kids get a present, but naughty kids get something worse than coal. What they receive is a long black switch that their parents can use to beat them. It's the same thing that Adrian Peterson, a Hall of Fame running back, used on his son back in 2014. This idea may come from Zwarte Piet, or Black Pete, a controversial assistant to Santa Claus who wears blackface and spanks naughty children with a birch rod. And I'm sorry if I mispronounced Zwarte Piet, that's my bad. But either way, this poem is really the origin of a lot of the essentials of Santa Claus. But there's still more to gather, because we aren't done just yet. Because in 1823, 2 years later, another poem was published, at first anonymously and later claimed authorship by Clement Clark Moore, a friend of Washington Irving. And it was also published in New York in a paper called the Troy Sentinel. This poem is called A Visit from St. Nicholas, but you might know it as The Night Before Christmas or 'Twas the Night Before Christmas. I had no idea that The Night Before Christmas was this old, or that it was the most popular depiction of Santa Claus in the history of the figure. This poem established two critical things: that Santa has 8 reindeer to pull a sled, and that he goes down a chimney to give gifts. Now this idea may not be too original, because the Norse god Odin and several other European gift-giving legends also are said to have gone down chimneys too, but either way, this poem is the most popular depiction of Santa to date, and it really cements a lot of things about the character. So here it is. I'm going to read it to you. "'Twas the night before Christmas when all through the house not a creature were stirring, not even a mouse. The stockings were hung by the chimney with care, in hopes that St. Nicholas soon would be there. The children were nestled all snug in their beds, while visions of sugar plums danced in their heads. And Mama in her kerchief and I in my cap had just settled our brains for a long winter's nap. When out on the lawn there arose such a clatter, I sprang from the bed to see what was the matter. Away to the window I flew like a flash, tore open the shutters and threw up the sash. The moon on the breast of the new-fallen snow gave the luster of midday to objects below, when what to my wondering eyes should appear but a miniature sleigh and 8 tiny reindeer. With a little old driver so lively and quick, I knew in a moment it must be Saint Nick. More rapid than eagles his coursers they came, and he whistled and shouted and called them by name. Now Dasher, now Dancer, now Prancer and Vixen, on Comet, on Cupid, on Donder and Blitzen. To the top of the porch, to the top of the wall, now dash away, dash away, dash away all. As dry leaves that before the wild hurricane fly, when they meet with an obstacle, mount to the sky. So up to the housetop the coursers they flew, with the sleigh full of toys and St. Nicholas too. And then in a twinkling I heard on the roof the prancing and pawing of each little hoof. As I drew in my head and was turning around, down the chimney St. Nicholas came with a bound. He was dressed all in fur from his head to his foot, and his clothes were all tarnished with ashes and soot. A bundle of toys he had flung on his back, and he looked like a peddler just opening his pack. His eyes, how they twinkled, his dimples, how merry, his cheeks were like roses, his nose like a cherry. His droll little mouth was drawn up like a bow, and the beard of his chin was as white as the snow. The stump of a pipe he held tight in his teeth, and the smoke had encircled his head like a wreath. He had a broad face and a little round belly that shook when he laughed like a bowl full of jelly. He was chubby and plump, a right jolly old elf, and I laughed when I saw him in spite of myself. A wink of his eye and a twist of his head soon gave me to know I had nothing to dread. He spoke not a word, but went straight to his work, and filled all the stockings, then turned with a jerk, and laying his finger aside of his nose, and giving a nod up the chimney he rose. He sprang to his sleigh, to his team gave a whistle, and away they all flew like the down of a thistle. But I heard him exclaim ere he drove out of sight, Happy Christmas to all, and to all a good night. This poem took America by storm, and 30 years later, it was published in England too, in 1853. And on this publication, a note was added stating that St. Nicholas was known as Christkindl in Pennsylvania, which was also a name being used as a substitute for the German gift giver Belschnickel. So here we see that Christkindl and Christkringle are the same thing, but they're also the same thing as Belschnickel and St. Nicholas, so things are getting mixed up here, but this is how it's gone so far. Regardless, this poem is the origin of the American Santa Claus, and it includes all the basic elements that we all know, except for the elves and the North Pole workshop. But even though this poem is the most critical piece in all of this, there's still one more thing to talk about, one more final piece to this Santa Claus puzzle. And that is Thomas Nast. This guy is a cartoonist and illustrator, and he started during the Civil War. And because of this, it was a very political time, and his Santa Claus depictions were mostly propaganda. His first drawing of Santa Claus was published in 1863 in Harper's Weekly. It depicts a fat old elf on a present-filled sleigh handing out a toy to some Union soldiers, but he's also wearing a starred coat and a striped pair of pants because propaganda, America, Union, all that good stuff. But then, in the same issue, there's a second drawing too, and in this one, Santa is shown climbing into a chimney while a mother prays on Christmas Eve, and then it shows Santa flying away on his sleigh while a Union soldier leans against a tree. These things only reinforce the idea from that poem from 1823, but there's still more to Thomas Nast than we have seen so far. Because then, 16 years later in 1879, he stated that Santa's workshop was at the North Pole, and he also drew various illustrations to show this. Then, just 2 years later, he truly cemented the modern image of Santa Claus as we know him, with his drawing, Merry Old Santa Claus. This is his most popular drawing of Santa Claus, and might be the most popular drawing of Santa Claus of all time. So, looking back, all the way from 270 to 1881, it took 1,611 years to form Santa Claus as we know him today. And he's not just American. He's part Greek thanks to Saint Nick. He's part Dutch thanks to Sinterklaas. He's part English thanks to Father Christmas, he's part German thanks to Kris Kringle and Belschnickel, and he's part American too. And maybe even more that we just don't know about. Santa Claus is the product of combining many similar traditions, folklores, and legends, and also adding some originality to them too. As a product, Santa Claus shows us that we all have a lot more in common than we actually realize. And I think it's important for us to highlight and recognize this during the holiday season, but also to keep this in mind between our yearly festivities as well. That's all from me. Thanks for watching.